Welcome back. Thank you for watching this interesting story. Let's quickly dive into part 2. The light stopped moving. It hovered in place, pulsing faintly as though waiting for her. Cassie's fear battled with her curiosity. Slowly, hesitantly, she took a step forward. "Cassie!" The voice came again, soft and melodic, but this time it sounded closer. Too close. Cassie spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The forest behind her was empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she turned back to the light. But it was gone. The clearing was plunged into darkness once more, and Cassie's hope crumbled. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to be here anymore," she sobbed, her voice barely audible. "I just want to go home." The storm continued to rage around her, indifferent to her cries. Cassie wrapped her arms around herself, rocking back and forth as she tried to block out the fear and despair. But deep in the shadows, she thought she heard something else, a faint rustling, followed by the sound of footsteps. She froze, her body tense as she strained to listen. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate and steady, coming closer and closer. Cassie's pulse quickened as she turned toward the sound, her eyes wide with fear. And then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, she saw it, a figure standing in the rain, its features obscured by the darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching her. Cassie's breath hitched, and she took a step back, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Who? Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. It tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that made her stomach drop. And then it stepped forward. The storm was relentless, its roar deafening as it tore through the forest. Claire Lacey pushed forward, her flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and a whistle dangling from the other. Her coat was soaked, her boots caked with mud, and her body trembling from the cold, but none of that mattered. Somewhere out here, Cassie was waiting for her, scared and alone. Lightning split the sky, casting the forest in stark relief for a brief moment. Claire caught a glimpse of the twisted branches overhead, their shadows like claws against the stormy backdrop. Thunder followed, shaking the ground beneath her feet. She stumbled but caught herself, her determination stronger than her fear. "Cassie!" she screamed, her voice hoarse from hours of shouting. The name echoed back at her, warped and faint, as though the forest itself was mocking her. Her flashlight beam flickered, threatening to go out entirely. She slapped it against her palm, muttering a prayer under her breath. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Please let me find her." The trail was long gone, washed away by the rain and swallowed by the shadows. Claire moved blindly now, guided only by the faint hope that she was heading in the right direction. Every step felt heavier, her soaked clothes clinging to her skin and sapping her strength. But she couldn't stop. Not now. As she trudged forward, the storm seemed to grow louder, the wind howling like a chorus of mournful voices. Claire shivered, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She had spent years in the outdoors, leading girls on hikes and camping trips, but she had never felt anything like this. The forest didn't just feel alive, it felt watchful, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something. "Cassie!" she called again, her voice cracking. "Cassie, answer me!" A rustling sound came from her left, barely audible over the storm. Claire froze, her flashlight darting toward the noise. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. She strained to listen, her pulse pounding in her ears. Then she heard it. "Cassie!" It was faint, carried on the wind like a whisper. Claire's heart leaped. She wasn't alone. Someone or something was out here with her. She shouted into the darkness, her voice desperate. "Cassie! Stay where you are. I'm coming." She moved toward the sound, her boots slipping on the wet ground. Her flashlight wavered, casting shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The voice came again, louder this time, but still distant. "Cassie!" Claire quickened her pace, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ignored the exhaustion in her limbs, the cold seeping into her bones. She had to keep going. She had to find her. The forest opened up into a small clearing, and Claire stumbled to a halt. The rain had lessened, turning into a steady drizzle, but the air felt heavier here, charged with an unnatural stillness. Her flashlight beam swept across the clearing, revealing twisted roots and gnarled trees. There was no sign of Cassie, but the voice was closer now. Too close. Cassie! Claire's grip on her flashlight tightened, her knuckles white. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Show yourself." The shadows seemed to shift, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement, a figure darting between the trees, pale and small. Her heart skipped a beat. "Cassie," she whispered, her voice cracking with hope and fear. The figure didn't respond. It moved deeper into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. Claire hesitated for only a moment before following, her feet slipping on the slick ground. She called out as she ran, her voice breaking. "Cassie, wait!" The forest closed in around her, the trees growing thicker and the air colder. Claire's flashlight flickered again, the beam sputtering as if it were being swallowed by the darkness. She stumbled but caught herself, pushing forward with sheer determination. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't calling Cassie's name. It was different, low and mournful, like a song carried on the wind. Claire froze, her flashlight shaking in her trembling hand. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Behind her, a figure stood at the edge of the clearing. It was small, childlike, but its features were obscured by the shadows. Claire's heart raced as she took a step closer, her voice shaking. "Cassie, is that you?" The figure tilted its head, a slow, unnatural motion. And then it whispered, "Claire." A chill ran down her spine. She staggered back, her flashlight beam flickering wildly. "Who? Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It melted into the shadows, leaving Claire alone in the clearing. The storm seemed to quiet for a moment, as though the forest was holding its breath. Claire's knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, her hands trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I tried to find you." The wind picked up again, carrying the voice through the trees one last time. "Cassie!" Claire's cries echoed into the storm, her voice growing weaker and weaker until it was swallowed by the darkness. And then the forest was silent. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving Blackwood Forest soaked and eerily quiet. The once raging wind was now a gentle whisper through the trees, and the rain had reduced to a fine mist that hung in the air like a veil. The campsite was a scene of chaos, with puddles pooling in uneven spots and the muddy ground littered with fallen branches. The sun struggled to break through the heavy gray clouds, casting a dim light over the clearing. The girls in the troop emerged cautiously from their tents, their faces pale and anxious. The storm had kept most of them awake, and the knowledge that Cassie was still missing weighed heavily on them. Lily, her tent mate, stood near the smoldering fire pit, clutching her jacket tightly around her. Guilt gnawed at her. She felt responsible for not noticing Cassie's absence sooner. "Mrs. Lacey," one of the girls called, her voice trembling. "Where's Mrs. Lacey?" Mr. Harris stepped forward, his face grim. He had been up all night, coordinating the counselors and keeping the girls calm while they waited for the storm to subside. But now, as the morning light revealed the absence of both Cassie and Mrs. Lacey, his worry deepened. "She hasn't come back," he admitted, his voice low. "She must still be out there looking for Cassie." The girls exchanged frightened glances, their whispers rising like a wave of unease. Julia, one of the younger counselors, approached Mr. Harris, her face etched with worry. "We need to call the Rangers," she said quietly. "This is too big for us to handle on our own." Mr. Harris nodded. "Agreed. I'll radio them now." The radio crackled to life as Mr. Harris relayed the situation to the nearest ranger station. His voice was calm and measured, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his fear. "We have 2 missing," he said. "1 adult, 1 child. The storm last night has made it impossible to track them. We need a search team immediately." The response came quickly. "Understood. We'll mobilize a team and be there within the hour. Stay with the group and keep everyone safe." Mr. Harris thanked them and turned to face the counselors and the troop. "Listen up," he said, his voice firm but kind. "Help is on the way." The Rangers will take over the search, and they'll find Cassie and Mrs. Lacey. But until then, we need to stick together. No one leaves the campsite, understood? The girls nodded, their fear palpable. Some huddled together, whispering about the storm and the strange sounds they had heard in the night. Lily remained apart from the others, staring into the forest with wide, haunted eyes. She could still hear Cassie's laughter in her mind, the way she had been so excited about the trip. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Please be okay," she whispered. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as they waited for the Rangers. The counselors tried to keep the girls occupied, assigning them small tasks like tidying up the campsite and preparing breakfast. But the atmosphere was heavy, and even the simplest activities felt like monumental efforts. Finally, the distant sound of engines broke the silence. A convoy of ranger trucks pulled into the clearing, their flashing lights cutting through the morning mist. The Rangers stepped out, their expressions serious as they assessed the situation. The leader, a tall man with a weathered face, approached Mr. Harris. "I'm Ranger Collins," he said, extending a hand. "We'll take it from here. Tell me everything you know." Mr. Harris quickly recounted the events of the previous night, the storm, Cassie's disappearance, and Mrs. Lacey's decision to search for her. Ranger Collins nodded, his eyes scanning the forest. "The storms made tracking difficult," he said, "but we'll do everything we can. We've got dogs and thermal imaging equipment. If they're out there, we'll find them." The Rangers wasted no time. They spread out into the forest, their dogs sniffing the ground for any trace of Cassie or Mrs. Lacey. The counselors and girls watched anxiously from the campsite, their hope flickering like a fragile flame. Hours passed with no word. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, swallowing the Rangers' calls and the sound of the dogs barking. Each moment without news felt like an eternity, and the girls' fear deepened. Finally, one of the Rangers returned, his face drawn. He spoke quietly with Ranger Collins, who nodded solemnly before addressing the group. "We've found something," he said, his voice grave. The counselors and girls held their breath as the ranger held up an object, a small, mud-streaked flashlight. Lily gasped, recognizing it immediately. "That's Cassie's," she cried, her voice breaking. The discovery reignited their hope, but it also raised more questions. Where was Cassie? Where was Mrs. Lacey? And why hadn't they returned to the campsite? The Rangers continued their search as the day wore on, but the forest offered no further clues. The clearing where the flashlight had been found showed no sign of Cassie or Mrs. Lacey, only trampled grass and disturbed leaves. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. By evening, the Rangers returned to the campsite, their expressions grim. "We'll resume at first light," Ranger Collins said. "It's too dangerous to search in the dark." The news was a heavy blow to the group. As the girls settled into their tents for another restless night, the forest seemed darker than ever, its silence oppressive. Lily lay awake, staring at the tent ceiling, her heart heavy with worry. Far out in the woods, beneath the cover of darkness, the faintest echo of a voice drifted through the trees. "Cassie!" Dawn came with muted light, the sun barely breaking through the dense canopy of Blackwood Forest. The campsite was tense and quiet, the Rangers and counselors moving with purpose as they prepared to resume the search for Cassie and Mrs. Lacey. The air was thick with dread. Every hour that passed felt heavier, the odds of finding them safe growing slimmer. Ranger Collins stood with his team near the edge of the forest, studying the map of the area. His finger traced the trails, stopping at the clearing where Cassie's flashlight had been found. "We'll focus our efforts here," he said. "This clearing is about 2 miles off the main trail. If they kept moving, they might be nearby. If not..." He trailed off, not wanting to voice the darker possibilities. Julia, the youngest counselor, approached him nervously. "Do you think they're okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Collins sighed, his eyes scanning the tree-line. "We'll do everything we can to bring them back," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. The storm had complicated matters, washing away tracks and making the forest more treacherous than usual. The search began anew, the Rangers fanning out into the woods with their dogs and equipment. The counselors stayed behind with the girls, trying to keep them calm and distracted, but the weight of the situation was impossible to ignore. Lily sat apart from the others, her knees pulled to her chest as she stared into the forest. She hadn't spoken much since the flashlight was found, guilt gnawing at her with every passing moment. "Lily," Julia said gently, sitting down beside her. "Are you okay?" Lily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I should have noticed she was gone sooner," she whispered. "What if something happens to her? It's my fault?" Julia placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's not your fault. None of this is. Cassie made a choice to leave the tent, and we're doing everything we can to find her. She's strong, Lily. Don't lose hope." Lily nodded, though her heart felt heavy. She looked back toward the forest, a part of her wishing she could join the search. She hated sitting here, feeling helpless while her friend was out there alone. Deep in the woods, the rangers combed the area near the clearing. The dogs barked occasionally, their noses to the ground, but there was no sign of Cassie or Mrs. Lacey. The forest was eerily silent, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent. Collins couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, a subtle wrongness that made his skin crawl. "We've got nothing," one of the rangers said, frustration creeping into his voice. "No tracks, no belongings, nothing. It's like they just vanished." Collins frowned, his brow furrowing as he considered their options. "Keep looking. They have to be here somewhere." As they pressed deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air was colder here, the shadows longer. Collins felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he passed an ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching out like claws. He stopped, shining his flashlight on the trunk. Something about it felt familiar, though he couldn't place why. "What is it?" another ranger asked, noticing Collins's hesitation. Collins shook his head. "Nothing. Let's keep moving." The group spread out, their voices calling for Cassie and Mrs. Lacey echoing through the trees. The forest swallowed the sound, offering no response. It was as if the woods themselves were keeping their secrets, holding them close. Back at the campsite, the counselors and girls waited anxiously for news. Lily couldn't take her eyes off the forest, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. She thought of Cassie's excitement on the bus ride, her wide-eyed wonder at the campfire. It didn't seem fair that someone so full of life could be lost to a place so dark and unforgiving. As the hours dragged on, the rangers returned, their expressions grim. Collins approached the group, his face etched with fatigue. "We've searched the entire area around the clearing," he said. "There's no sign of them." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her knees. The other girls began to cry softly, their fear and grief spilling over. Julia stepped forward, her voice trembling. "What do we do now?" Collins hesitated, then said, "We'll expand the search radius tomorrow. For now, we need to regroup. The forest is too dangerous to keep searching after dark." The counselors nodded reluctantly, though their hearts were heavy. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the campsite. The girls huddled together in small groups, their whispers tinged with fear. Some spoke of the stories they'd heard about Blackwood Forest, the legends of people who went missing, of voices calling in night. Lily stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the treeline. She thought she saw something move, a flicker of light, like a lantern bobbing in the distance. She blinked, but it was gone. Her heart raced as a faint sound reached her ears, barely audible over the murmurs of the group. "Cassie!" She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was soft and distant, but unmistakable. She looked around, but no one else seemed to hear it. Was it her imagination? Or was Cassie really out there calling for help? Before she could decide, the sound faded, leaving only the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lily clenched her fists, determination sparking in her chest. She couldn't just sit here. If no one else could find Cassie, maybe she could. That night, as the others drifted off to sleep, Lily made her decision. She would wait for the cover of darkness and go into the woods alone. The campsite settled into a somber stillness as the sun set, casting long shadows across the clearing. The girls, exhausted from fear and worry, huddled in their tents, their quiet sobs muffled by the rustle of the wind. The counselors sat around the cold fire pit, speaking in hushed tones about their next steps, their faces drawn and weary. Lily, however, couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Cassie's face, bright and eager as she talked about her excitement for the trip. The memory made her chest ache. She had heard the voice earlier, faint and distant, calling Cassie's name. It had to mean something. She refused to believe Cassie was gone. As the others drifted off into uneasy rest, Lily sat by her tent flap, staring out at the dark forest. The rangers had said they would resume the search at first light, but that felt too far away. What if Cassie didn't have until morning? What if she was out there, cold and scared, waiting for someone to come? Her fists clenched as her resolve hardened. She wouldn't wait any longer. She had to go into the woods, even if it meant going alone. Meanwhile, in the counselor's circle, Julia broke the heavy silence with a shaky question. "Do you think—" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think the stories are true? About the forest?" Mr. Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't put much stock in campfire tales," he said, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Legends are just stories meant to scare kids into behaving. That's all." Julia wasn't convinced. But what about the voices? The ones the rangers said they've heard before, calling people into the woods? Her eyes darted to the dark tree-line. They said no one who followed them ever came back. Mr. Harris frowned. "And that's exactly why we don't spread those stories around," he said firmly. "The last thing we need is for anyone else to go missing." But Julia's words lingered, unsettling the group. Blackwood Forest was known for its strange occurrences, missing hikers, eerie whispers, and sightings of shadowy figures. Locals often spoke of the Wailing Woods, where the trees seemed to mourn the lost. No one could explain the phenomena, but the stories persisted, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Lily didn't know about the legends, but as she stepped into the forest, a shiver ran down her spine. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled like a canopy of skeletal fingers. The air was colder here, the stillness oppressive. She clutched her flashlight tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Cassie," she called softly, her voice trembling. "It's me, Lily. Where are you?" The forest remained silent, but Lily pressed on, her determination outweighing her fear. She followed the faint trail the rangers had marked earlier, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Every sound made her jump, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, but she forced herself to keep moving. As she ventured deeper, the atmosphere changed. The trees seemed older here, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The ground was uneven, littered with roots and fallen branches. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying faint echoes that made Lily's skin crawl. She stopped abruptly, her flashlight catching something glinting on the ground. Kneeling down, she picked it up, a small silver whistle. Her breath hitched. It was Mrs. Lacey's, the one she always wore around her neck. Lily's hands trembled as she stared at it, her mind racing. "Mrs. Lacey," she called, her voice breaking. "Are you here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Lily rose to her feet, clutching the whistle as she scanned the forest. The shadows seemed to shift around her, the trees whispering secrets she couldn't understand. She took a step forward, her flashlight beam flickering, and froze. A faint light appeared in the distance, bobbing through the trees like a lantern. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though guiding her. Lily's heart raced. She wanted to believe it was a sign, a way to find Cassie or Mrs. Lacey. But something about the light felt wrong. The legends Julia had mentioned began to creep into her mind, stories of ghostly lights leading people into the woods, never to return. Lily shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. "It's just a story," she whispered to herself. "It's not real." She took a cautious step toward the light, then another. Her footsteps were slow, hesitant, as she followed it deeper into the forest. The light flickered, always staying just out of reach, but Lily couldn't stop. She had to know where it led. "Cassie!" She called again, her voice echoing through the trees. "Mrs. Lacey!" The light paused, hovering in place for a moment, before vanishing entirely. Lily stopped, her heart sinking. She was surrounded by darkness now, her flashlight flickering as if it, too, was about to give up. The forest pressed in around her, its silence heavy and oppressive, and then she heard it, a faint voice, soft and mournful, carried on the wind. "Cassie!" Lily's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, her flashlight darting through the shadows. The voice came again, louder this time, but still distant. "Cassie!" It wasn't Cassie's voice, and it wasn't Mrs. Lacey's. It was something else entirely. Lily's courage faltered as a chill ran down her spine. The forest seemed alive now, watching her, waiting. She gripped the whistle tightly, her pulse racing as the voice grew louder, echoing through the trees. "Cassie!" Lily stumbled back, her flashlight beam trembling. She wasn't sure what she was following anymore, and she wasn't sure she wanted to find out. The forest grew darker as Lily pressed forward, the faint glow of her flashlight barely piercing the oppressive gloom. The voice calling Cassie's name had gone silent, leaving only the sound of her own unsteady breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. She glanced back over her shoulder, half expecting to see the light she had been following, but the woods behind her were empty. She swallowed hard, gripping Mrs. Lacey's whistle tightly in her hand. This was a mistake, she thought, her resolve wavering. I shouldn't have come out here alone. But then, just as she was about to turn back, she noticed something ahead, a break in the trees where faint moonlight illuminated an open space. A clearing. Lily's heart quickened. Perhaps Cassie or Mrs. Lacey had taken shelter there during the storm. Gathering her courage, she stepped into the clearing. The air felt colder here, heavy with an unnatural stillness that made her skin prickle. The ground was littered with moss-covered stones, their shapes uneven and jagged, as if they had been part of something once, something long forgotten. In the center of the clearing stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches stretching high into the sky. Its bark was darker than any tree Lily had ever seen, almost black, and its roots twisted like the veins of an ancient giant. She approached cautiously, her flashlight aimed at the tree's base. There, nestled among the roots, she spotted something that made her heart leap, a piece of cloth, bright and unmistakable. Cassie's scarf. Lily dropped to her knees, grabbing the scarf with trembling hands. "Cassie," she called, her voice cracking. "Cassie, I found your scarf. Are you here?" Her shout echoed through the clearing, but no answer came. She clutched the scarf to her chest, a mix of relief and fear washing over her. Cassie had been here, but where was she now? As she rose to her feet, something about the tree caught her attention. Its bark wasn't just dark, it seemed to shimmer, almost as if it were wet. Lily stepped closer, aiming her flashlight at the trunk. Her breath caught as she realized the surface was etched with strange symbols, their lines twisting and curling in patterns that made her head ache to look at. A chill ran down her spine. She had heard stories about Blackwood Forest, about the Whispering Tree, a cursed landmark said to trap the souls of the lost. It was just a legend, wasn't it? A story told to scare campers and keep them from wandering too far. But standing here in the shadow of this ancient tree, Lily wasn't so sure anymore. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, a soft rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. She spun around, her flashlight darting across the clearing. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" The rustling stopped. The clearing was silent again, but Lily's heart pounded in her chest. She felt eyes on her, watching from the shadows. Then the voice returned. "Cassie." It was louder now, coming from just beyond the clearing. Lily's legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to move, taking hesitant steps toward the sound. The scarf was still clutched in her hand, a lifeline to the friend she was so desperate to find. The edge of the clearing gave way to dense underbrush, and Lily hesitated. Her flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. The voice called again, insistent, and Lily felt an unnatural pull, as though the forest itself were urging her forward. "Cassie!" The voice was softer now, almost mournful. Lily's breath hitched. It didn't sound like a person. It sounded like the forest itself was calling her friend's name. She took another step, then stopped. A figure was standing in the trees, just beyond the reach of her light. It was small, childlike, and completely still. Lily's blood ran cold. "Cassie," she whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't move. It stood motionless, its outline blurred by the shadows. Lily's heart hammered in her chest as she took a cautious step closer. "Cassie, is that you?" The figure tilted its head, a slow, unnatural motion that sent a wave of fear crashing over her. Lily stumbled back, her flashlight beam shaking as she tried to focus on the figure. But before she could get a clear look, it vanished, dissolving into the darkness like smoke. Lily's hands shook as she clutched the scarf tighter. The forest seemed to close in around her, its silence deafening. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to leave the clearing and never look back. But something stopped her. A whisper, "Help me!" It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Lily's fear gave way to determination. If there was even a chance that Cassie was still alive, she couldn't abandon her. She turned back toward the clearing, her flashlight aimed at the twisted tree. And that's when she saw it. Carved into the bark, among the strange symbols, was a name. Cassie! The letters were crude and uneven, as if etched in desperation. Lily's stomach turned as her flashlight moved lower, revealing more names, each one carved into the dark bark. Some were old, the letters faded and weathered. Others were fresh, their edges sharp. Her breath caught as she spotted another name, lower on the trunk, Claire. Lily stumbled back, her heart racing. She turned and ran, her flashlight bobbing wildly as she fled the clearing. The scarf slipped from her grasp, fluttering to the ground, forgotten in her panic. Behind her, the forest whispered her name. Lily burst through the dense underbrush, her heart pounding and her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The clearing and its cursed tree were far behind her now, but the oppressive feeling of being watched hadn't left. The forest seemed alive, its shadows twisting and shifting as if something unseen moved just out of her sight. Her flashlight flickered weakly, the light sputtering in and out, and she shook it desperately. "Stay on," she whispered to herself. "Please stay on." The faint beam steadied, but the cold realization settled in her chest. She was lost. The campsite was nowhere in sight, and the path she had followed earlier had disappeared, swallowed by the endless labyrinth of trees. Lily leaned against a tree, her trembling hands gripping the flashlight. Her mind raced as she tried to remember her way back, but every direction looked the same. The forest pressed in around her, its silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. "Think, Lily," she told herself, fighting the rising panic. "You have to stay calm. You've got to find your way back." She closed her eyes, taking slow, steady breaths. Her fingers brushed against the whistle she still held, the cool metal a small comfort. Mrs. Lacey's whistle. It felt like a reminder of her purpose, of why she had come out here in the first place. "Cassie," she murmured, opening her eyes, "I'll find you." But even as she spoke the words, doubt gnawed at the edges of her resolve. The strange voices, the eerie clearing, the names carved into the tree, it all felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And now, she was as lost as Cassie. Summoning her courage, Lily pushed off the tree and started walking. She kept her steps deliberate and steady, her flashlight sweeping the ground for any sign of a trail. The silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. Every few steps, she called out, her voice wavering. "Cassie! Mrs. Lacey! Can you hear me?" The forest gave no reply. The farther she walked, the stranger the woods became. The trees grew thicker and more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and roots that seemed to writhe beneath her feet. Lily's flashlight caught glimpses of strange markings on the trees, symbols she didn't recognize, carved deep into the bark. She shivered, her skin crawling as the air grew colder. It felt as though the forest itself was alive, watching her every move. She clutched the whistle tighter, its presence a small anchor in the sea of darkness. And then she heard it, a faint sound, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. It was soft, like a distant whisper carried on the wind. Lily froze, straining to listen. The sound came again, clearer this time. It wasn't the eerie voice she had heard before, the one that called Cassie's name. This was different. It sounded like crying. Lily's pulse quickened as she turned toward the sound, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. "Cassie," she called, hope and fear mingling in her voice. "Is that you?" The crying didn't stop. It grew louder, more desperate, and Lily felt an overwhelming urge to follow it. She moved cautiously, her flashlight beam trembling as she stepped over roots and ducked under low-hanging branches. The sound led her deeper into the woods, where the trees grew so close together that their branches formed a nearly impenetrable canopy. The crying was close now, just beyond a cluster of thick trees. Lily's hands shook as she pushed through the underbrush, her heart racing. "Cassie!" she cried, her voice breaking. "It's me! I'm here!" She stumbled into a small clearing and froze. There, sitting on the ground with her back to Lily, was a figure. It was small, childlike, and hunched over as it sobbed into its hands. Cassie's bright yellow jacket was unmistakable, even in the dim light of the forest. Lily's eyes filled with tears of relief. "Cassie!" she exclaimed, rushing forward. "Oh my God, Cassie! I've been looking everywhere for you." The figure didn't move. Lily stopped a few feet away, her joy faltering. "Cassie," she said more cautiously, her flashlight aimed at the figure. "It's me, Lily. Are you okay?" The sobbing stopped abruptly. Lily's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly turned its head. Her flashlight illuminated a pale, expressionless face, its eyes empty and lifeless. A chill ran down her spine as she stumbled back, her hands shaking so badly that the flashlight slipped from her grasp and fell to the ground. The figure rose to its feet, its movements unnatural, almost mechanical. Lily couldn't breathe, couldn't move as it stepped closer, its lifeless eyes locked on hers. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Lily alone in the clearing. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, her chest heaving with sobs. The forest was silent again, but the memory of those eyes burned in her mind. She grabbed her flashlight, her hands trembling, and scrambled to her feet. She had to get out of here. She had to find someone, anyone, who could help. As she turned to leave, a faint voice drifted through the trees, soft and haunting. "Cassie!" Lily ran, the whisper following her into the darkness. Lily sprinted through the forest, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The voice calling Cassie's name echoed faintly behind her, carried by the wind. It seemed to follow her no matter how fast or far she ran, a chilling reminder of the lifeless figure she had just encountered. The memory of its empty eyes burned in her mind, making her chest tighten with fear. Her flashlight bobbed wildly as she darted between trees, its faint beam barely illuminating the twisted roots and uneven ground. She stumbled once, catching herself against the rough bark of a tree, and paused to catch her breath. The forest was silent now, the voice gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained. Lily wiped at her tears, her hands trembling. "You have to keep going," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "You have to find someone." Forcing herself to move, she pressed forward, hoping desperately that she was heading in the direction of the campsite. The forest seemed endless, the trees blending together in an impenetrable wall of shadows. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woods themselves were alive, shifting and twisting to keep her lost. Minutes felt like hours as she trudged on, her body aching with exhaustion and fear. She tried to focus on the hope that someone, anyone, might find her. "The Rangers are searching. They'll find me. They'll find Cassie and Mrs. Lacey." Just as she thought she couldn't take another step, she saw it, a faint glow through the trees. Relief surged through her chest as she quickened her pace, her flashlight's beam bouncing erratically. The light grew brighter, and soon she recognized it as the campfire, now reignited. She burst into the clearing, gasping for air, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. The sight of the counselors and the rangers made her knees buckle. Mr. Harris was the first to notice her. Lily, he shouted, rushing toward her. Thank God. Where have you been? The others gathered around, their faces etched with worry. Julia knelt beside Lily, helping her to sit down. Are you hurt? She asked, her voice trembling. What happened? Lily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I went into the woods, she stammered. I thought I could find Cassie, but there's something out there. The Rangers exchanged wary glances. What do you mean? Asked Ranger Collins, his tone firm but concerned. Lily struggled to find the words. I found her scarf, she said, holding up the bright yellow fabric, and Mrs. Lacey's whistle. They were near this tree. She shuddered, her voice faltering. It was huge and dark, with symbols carved into it. And names. Their names. The group fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Mr. Harris's face paled. Cassie's name, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily nodded. And Mrs. Lacey's. It was like they were left there on purpose. The Rangers looked uneasy, but Ranger Collins pressed on. What else did you see? Lily hesitated, her mind racing. She didn't want to relive the moment, but she forced herself to speak. There was someone there, she whispered. A figure. It looked like Cassie, but it wasn't her. Its eyes were empty, and when it looked at me, I felt. She broke off, clutching her arms as a shiver ran through her. It wasn't human. A heavy silence fell over the group. The counselors exchanged nervous glances, and some of the girls in the distance, overhearing the conversation, huddled closer together. The fire crackled softly, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill that seemed to settle over the camp. Ranger Collins knelt in front of Lily, his expression serious. You've been through a lot, he said gently, but I need you to tell me exactly where you found the tree. Can you lead us there? Lily's stomach turned at the thought of going back to that clearing, but she knew she didn't have a choice. If there was any hope of finding Cassie and Mrs. Lacey, they had to go. She nodded shakily. I'll try. Collins stood, turning to his team. Gear up, he ordered. We're heading out. Julia placed a comforting hand on Lily's shoulder. You don't have to go with them, she said softly. You've done enough. But Lily shook her head, determination flickering in her eyes. I have to. I can't let them stay out there. Not alone. The Rangers prepared quickly, their flashlights and radios at the ready. Collins gave Lily a reassuring nod as the group set off, leaving the camp behind once more. The forest loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. But this time Lily wasn't alone. As they moved deeper into the woods, the oppressive silence returned, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. Lily stayed close to Collins, her flashlight aimed at the ground. Every step felt heavier, the memory of the clearing and the figure haunting her thoughts. When they reached the area she had described, Lily stopped abruptly, her breath catching in her throat. The clearing was just as she had left it, the massive tree standing in the center like a sentinel of shadows. The Rangers spread out, their flashlights illuminating the strange symbols carved into the bark. What is this? One of them muttered, running a hand over the markings. I've never seen anything like it. Collins crouched near the base of the tree, his sharp eyes scanning the ground. He picked up Cassie's scarf and Mrs. Lacey's whistle, his jaw tightening. They were here, he said quietly. No doubt about it. The group's attention was drawn to the names etched into the tree. Collins's flashlight revealed dozens of them, some faded with age, others fresh and sharp. His face darkened as he read the names aloud. Cassie, Claire, and more. His voice trailed off as he straightened, turning to face the group. Whatever this place is, it's not normal. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with anticipation. And then, faintly, the voice returned, carrying through the trees like a mournful song. Cassie! The Rangers froze, their flashlights swinging wildly as they tried to locate the source. Lily clutched Julia's arm, her heart pounding as the voice grew louder. And then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. The figure stepped forward, its shape blurred by the shifting shadows and the faint light of the flashlights. Lily's breath caught in her throat as her mind raced, torn between hope and fear. It was small, childlike, too much like Cassie to dismiss outright. Cassie, she whispered, her voice trembling. The Rangers raised their flashlights in unison, their beams converging on the figure. For a moment, it looked like a young girl with long, damp hair, her head bowed, as though she were shielding her eyes from the light. Her clothes were tattered, her pale skin almost glowing in the darkness. "Cassie!" Lily cried, taking a step forward, but Ranger Collins grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he said, his voice low and tense. "Something's not right." The figure raised its head slowly, and Lily's hope turned to terror. The face that looked back at her was not Cassie's. Its features were distorted, its eyes dark voids that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. A chilling smile spread across its face, too wide and too sharp, sending a wave of cold dread through the group. One of the Rangers muttered a curse under his breath, stepping back. "What is that?" he whispered. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt almost mocking. And then, without warning, it vanished, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. The Rangers' flashlights swept the clearing, but there was no trace of it. The forest fell silent. Lily's legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, clutching her chest as she struggled to breathe. Julia knelt beside her, her face pale. "It's okay," she said, though her voice wavered. "It's gone." Ranger Collins scanned the tree line, his expression grim. "We're leaving," he announced. "Now." "What about Cassie?" Lily asked, her voice breaking. "We can't just leave her here." Collins crouched beside her, his tone firm but kind. "We don't know what we're dealing with," he said. "It's not safe. We'll regroup and bring more people tomorrow, but right now we have to get back to camp." Lily wanted to argue, but the fear in his eyes silenced her. She nodded reluctantly, allowing Julia to help her to her feet. The Rangers formed a protective circle around the group as they began their retreat, their flashlights casting long, trembling beams through the trees. The walk back to camp felt endless. Every sound, every shadow set Lily's nerves on edge. She clutched Mrs. Lacey's whistle tightly, the metal cool against her palm. It felt like the only thing tethering her to reality in this nightmare. The voice returned as they neared the edge of the forest, faint and mournful. "Cassie!" Lily froze, her heart aching at the sound. She turned instinctively, scanning the darkness for any sign of her friend. But Collins gripped her shoulder, pulling her forward. "Keep moving," he said firmly. "Don't listen to it." The voice faded, swallowed by the rustling of leaves and the crunch of footsteps. The group emerged into the clearing of the campsite, the warmth of the fire a stark contrast to the chilling atmosphere of the forest. The counselors and remaining girls rushed to meet them, their relief palpable. "Did you find her?" Mr. Harris asked urgently. Collins shook his head, his expression grim. "Not yet, but we'll try again at first light." The counselors exchanged worried glances, but no one argued. The girls huddled around the fire, their faces pale and drawn. The air was thick with unspoken fear, the kind that no amount of reassurances could dispel. Lily sat apart from the group, staring into the flames. The image of the figure haunted her, its dark eyes and unsettling smile etched into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that they had been close to something, close to Cassie, or perhaps close to a truth they weren't meant to find. As the night wore on, the camp grew quiet, the fire crackling softly in the background. Lily couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the voice, faint and far away, calling Cassie's name. She wondered if it was truly Cassie out there, waiting for someone to find her, or if it was something else entirely. The forest loomed in the distance, its shadows deep and impenetrable. It felt alive, a presence that watched and waited, biding its time. Lily shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. For the first time since she had arrived, she felt truly afraid. And somewhere deep in the woods, the voice whispered again, soft and mournful. "Cassie!" The morning arrived sluggishly, the pale light of dawn barely piercing the thick canopy above Blackwood Forest. The camp was quiet, the tension palpable as the Rangers and counselors prepared to resume the search. Despite their fatigue, there was no time to waste. Cassie and Mrs. Lacey had been missing for over a day, and with each passing hour, hope dwindled. Lily sat on the edge of her tent, clutching a steaming cup of tea that Julia had made for her. She hadn't slept. Every time she closed her eyes, the figure's hollow gaze haunted her, its eerie smile etched into her memory. She glanced toward the forest, her stomach twisting. Somewhere out there, Cassie and Mrs. Lacey were waiting to be found, or worse, waiting for something else to find them. Ranger Collins stood at the center of the campsite, his voice steady as he addressed the group. "We'll split into 3 teams and cover a wider area today," he said. Lily described the clearing and the tree she found yesterday. Team A will focus there, while the rest of us will fan out along the surrounding trails. Julia raised her hand hesitantly. "And if we see anything unusual?" Collins's jaw tightened. "You call it in immediately. No one goes off alone." "Understood." The group murmured their agreement, though the unease in their expressions was evident. Lily set her cup down and approached Collins. "I want to come," she said firmly. "I can help." Collins hesitated. "You've been through a lot," he said. "It's not safe." Lily met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "Cassie is my friend. I'm not going to sit here while everyone else is out there looking for her." Collins studied her for a moment before nodding reluctantly. "Stay with me," he said, "and don't wander off." The forest was a different place in the daylight, but not less intimidating. The sunlight filtered weakly through the canopy, casting long, dappled shadows on the ground. The rangers moved methodically, their voices low, as they coordinated their search. Lily followed close behind Collins, her flashlight gripped tightly in one hand despite the daylight. They reached the clearing within the hour. The massive, gnarled tree loomed in the center, its dark bark and strange carvings as unsettling as Lily remembered. She stopped a few feet away, her breath catching in her throat. "Anything?" Collins asked, his voice breaking her trance. Lily shook her head, her eyes scanning the tree for any new clues. The names carved into the bark seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, as though the tree itself were alive. She shuddered, stepping back. The rangers spread out, combing the clearing for any sign of Cassie or Mrs. Lacey. Collins knelt near the base of the tree, examining the disturbed earth and scattered leaves. "Looks like someone was here recently," he said, holding up a broken branch. "But it's hard to tell how long ago." Lily turned toward the tree line, her gaze drawn to the shadows between the trees. A strange sensation washed over her, a mix of fear and familiarity. She took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding, and then she saw it. A figure stood just beyond the clearing, half hidden by the trees. It was small, childlike, and completely still. Lily's breath hitched as recognition flooded her. "Cassie!" she cried, breaking into a run. "Wait!" Collins shouted, but Lily didn't stop. She reached the edge of the clearing, her eyes locked on the figure. It was Cassie, her yellow jacket unmistakable, her dark hair falling in damp strands around her face. She stood motionless, her back turned to Lily. "Cassie, it's me!" Lily called, her voice breaking. "I'm here! Come back to camp!" The figure didn't move. Lily slowed, her steps faltering as she drew closer. Something about Cassie's stance felt wrong, too rigid, too still. Her heart pounded as she reached out, a trembling hand. "Cassie!" she whispered. The figure turned. Lily's scream tore through the forest. It wasn't Cassie. The face that looked back at her was pale and lifeless, the eyes dark voids that seemed to pull her in. The figure smiled, its lips curling in an unnatural way, and Lily stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. We've come to the end of part 2. Please subscribe to Jayville Stories to watch part 3, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to always get notified for stories like this. Thank you, and stay tuned for part 3.